Well, thank you for joining us for the lecture today. I'm Bahman Bakhtiari. I'm the Executive Director of the Basketball Institute. We are an institute located in Salt Lake City, Utah, and we have had several programs and events that focus on US-Iran friendship history and better understanding of Iran and its history. So today, we are very pleased to have Professor Karim, who's going to talk about what makes us Iranian, and Professor Matthew Shannon, our fellow, will introduce her shortly. I just want to bring to your attention that our next lecture is by Reza Aslan. He has completed his book on Howard Baskerville, the American martyr in Persia, and Reza will be with us on April 19th, the anniversary actually of the death of Howard Baskerville, to talk about his forthcoming book. He will do some reading of his book, so I highly encourage you to register for that talk, and we look forward to seeing you for our next event. For our future activities, you can always visit our website. So I now pass it to Matt, who will introduce Persis for you.
Well, thank you so much to the Baskerville Institute and to everybody who's attended our webinars this year, and to all of you out there today. It's great to spend some time with you. And it's also great to have Dr. Persis Karim here with us to give a talk and facilitate a conversation on what makes us Iranian, an exploration of the Iranian diaspora 40 years on. Dr. Karim holds the Neda Nobari Chair and directs the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. Really the first center of its kind, established, I think, in 2017. Also at San Francisco State, she teaches in the Department of Comparative and World Literature. For those who have been following this subject over the years, we've seen Dr. Karim write and edit many books and special issues of journals for well over 2 decades. We can find her guest editorial work with the journals Iranian Studies, Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States, and Comparative Studies of South Asian, African, and Middle East Studies. Especially important are the 3 anthologies that Dr. Karim has edited. They are titled, without the subtitles, just titles, Tremors, published in 2013, Let Me Tell You Where I've Been, published in 2006, and A World Between in 1999. So we could go on and on introducing Dr. Karim, but I think that it would be best to turn the floor over to you now. So with no further ado, Persis Karim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Matthew, Dr. Shannon, and thank you, Bahman, Dr. Bakhtiari, for this wonderful opportunity. And also special thanks to Dilara Hosseini, who helped with all the getting me ready for this. I'm a little technophobic, even though I've been doing the pandemic for 2 years. And I'm really thrilled to be with you, because I think even when we talk about the diaspora, we're also talking about the exchange and movement of people and ideas. And I think what kind of situates diaspora is this idea of connection and holding connection between the homeland of Iran and wherever diaspora communities are. So I'm going to show you some slides if I can get screen sharing. All right, so I'm going to run through some slides, which are sort of basically framing for our conversation, Matthew, and I hope that it really is designed to maybe perhaps more than identify a concrete body of research, to reflect a little bit on the last 40+ years and how I've witnessed some changes in the way that we narrate and also use various terminologies to discuss the idea of diaspora. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what I see from the perspective of being in North America, which is to contextualize it from the point of view of where I've been looking at it most immediately. But I want to note that the idea of the diaspora and the Iranian diaspora is really much larger than North America. It's global, it's transnational, and it's fluid, meaning there is movement back and forth. So this is just if we think about North America as the center, that I'm not the center, but a center from which I'm looking at these issues. You can see that in North America, there's a movement out towards the global and the transnational. And then it's a series of circles, and then Iran being the outermost. But the arrows are to sort of situate the idea that there is no static diaspora. It's ever changing. It's influenced by public discourses. It's influenced by movement of people, immigration patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So I mostly wanted to identify that I am speaking mostly about North America because that's what I've been looking at for the last 20 plus years, but that it's certainly not exclusive to North America. And it's really important that when we talk about diaspora, we even use the idea of diasporas or diaspora communities. So I want to note some very important thinkers who've helped shape this conversation about the Iranian diaspora. And of course, it goes without saying that Hamid Nafisi is a very important one. However, the idea of the terminology of diaspora, I think, is relatively newish because when Iranians first came here in larger numbers, not that they came exclusively in 1979, but larger numbers came as refugees or asylum seekers or immigrants. We referred to them in those terms. But I think as the migration patterns have shifted, both ebbed and increased, we've now kind of come to accept the idea that diaspora is a useful term because it represents far more than a singular experience of immigration. When Babak Elahi and I edited the South Asian and I forget, comparative studies of Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, we identified the idea that diaspora is what Iranians are and the experiences they have as a result of having left Iran, and that a diasporic community, to remain a community, looks both to its past and its future. And I would argue that even though that was something we wrote in 2011, those kind of grounding principles are still at work when we think about the Iranian diaspora. Hamid Nafisi was one of the first people to start using this term, diaspora, and he used it to identify the necessary collective that emerged both in the origination and in the destination, and then that it also represents collective memory, an idealized homeland, and it's constitutive of the diasporic identity. Another colleague who I think has done a lot to move the field forward is Dr. Amy Malek. And she identifies that Iranians are part of a diaspora and there are shifts in their self-identification. But one of the things that I think she really clearly identifies is the role of online identities and online communities, both around 2000 when we had the publication Iranian.com, but now I would argue much more prevalent in social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those in the role of the changing experience of what we call diaspora. So what I think are principles of how people view diaspora and diaspora consciousness are rooted in some very sort of basic ideas: language, where you're born, what your parental or your family heritage is, religious and ethnic affiliations, your education, your immigration history, and then looking back at customs, traditions, and rituals that you practice or utilize in your newer context, food and foodways, inherited nostalgia and trauma, and also connections to family in Iran. I think all of these are still prevalent in many respects in terms of a kind of diaspora consciousness, but I think they're also shifting as we have more generations born outside of Iran, mixed marriages of Iranians and non-Iranians, and also that the language of what we think about of diaspora consciousness is influenced by larger events taking shape in the world. I just wanted to point out a few interesting kind of historical markers about how Iranian.com, a publication that was the first online publication for Iranians who were scattered around the globe, was in many ways directed towards the idea of looking back nostalgically, identifying loss and trauma. And this is an article that was in a 2003 issue of Iranian.com, and it's about Nowruz. And the sentiment, of course, of this article is that it's never going to be the same, and that, you know, there was a certain way of doing it. So this idea of sort of tradition, and even the title Nowruz is never the same. Another holiday or ritual that I saw quite a few articles in Iranian.com was about Yalda, identifying what it is and connecting it to other winter solstice events in the world. And I think one of the things about Iranian.com that was very interesting was that it was directed to Iranians in the diaspora. It was a kind of collective publication for Iranians themselves, whereas today we see social media being directed outward, less about just for each other. Some of the trends that I think are important to identify in a more recent context, particularly in the US, and here I'm limiting myself to largely events in the US, but these are not the exclusive events that I see shaping some of the Iranian diaspora experiences. Certainly 9/11, which I think had a profound impact on Iranians in this country, but elsewhere around the globe. And what we know is that Iranians are often implicated with other events and also with the Iranian government itself. The other thing that I think is really important is to think about the contestation of singularized Iranian identities, that people began to see themselves in, for example, a US context as Syrian Iranian or Kurdish Iranian, or in context of mixed marriages between Iranians and non-Iranians. And then also more recently, the rejection of some of the dominant narratives that I think were a result of a kind of defensive stance among many Iranians post 1979, 1980, when there was the image of the hostage crisis. So some of the rejection of the Aryan myth, a sort of nostalgia for the days of the Shah, have been mitigated by, I think, changes among younger people in this country. And then also race and racialized experiences of Iranians as a result of both 9/11 and earlier incidences. There's also the growth of civic and policy organizations dedicated to Iranian or Iranian-American or other Middle Eastern hyphenated issues and contexts. I think all these issues represent kind of public discourses that push and influence how Iranians see themselves in a diasporic lens. And then more recently, of course, the election of Donald Trump, the exit from the nuclear deal, the dramatic effects of the Muslim ban, particularly in the United States, calls for being counted on the US Census, both in 2010 and 2020. And then the lingering effects of Trump's policies towards the Middle East, and in particular towards Iran, with increased sanctions, and then of course the Soleimani assassination. And then what I see among younger people is a real shift in the desire to look at Iran and Iranianness through the lens of a kind of decolonizing and decentering of whiteness, which to me is really important, that we recognize that for younger people born in the US, their sense of what it is to be Iranian is much more tied to some of these other discourses around looking at imperial histories and also racialized histories. And then, of course, last is the growth of social media and opportunities that have been presented for more positive representations. I'm just going to pause here and ask Matthew if you have any comments or clarifying questions that you think would be helpful.
I don't know that I have anything I'd ask right now. I don't want to interrupt the flow of the talk, but I'll certainly have a few when at the conclusion. Yeah.
Okay. And then I want to sort of shift to thinking a little bit about the terms of an Iranian diasporic identity that are in some ways both reflective of 9/11, but also the tensions between Iran and the US that have been ongoing over the last 40 years. And of course, Dr. Neda Nobari's book, The Limits of Whiteness, was really groundbreaking in her articulation about the ways in which Iranians have a limited capacity for both participating in something that's white passing, but also that their legal status is always undermined by these larger discourses around how the US and Iran are in a sort of state of constant tension. So she says that despite their legal classification as white, the 21st century experience of Iranians and other Middle Easterners exemplify an extension of Mia Twan's concept of the forever foreigner, in which no degree of citizenship, legal whiteness, occupational and education success, or assimilatory effects or self-identification as American render Middle Easterners fully white in day-to-day life. I think this is very important also because while Iranians and other Middle Eastern people attempted to classify themselves in the US Census, that policy was essentially tossed aside by the Trump administration. So there are very few opportunities to sort of publicly name yourself, identify yourself as part of a larger diasporic community, but against that, you're identified through the lens of what Dr. Makbouleh calls a kind of limited whiteness. I just wanted to point out a few interesting events that happened in the context of the Trump administration that I think really, at least in my mind, pointed to a kind of attempt to render some kind of consciousness in a prideful way, because when you have a US senator talking about, the possibility of doing a DNA test, and this was in response to Elizabeth Warren, he said that, it would be tragic if he did the DNA test and found out that he had Iranian ancestry. These are public sort of microaggressions or outright racist comments that I think young people were especially cognizant of. And to some degree, I think what it suggests is this free-floating racialized sensibility that always exists in the US society that positions Iranians to be outsiders, regardless of, whether they're born here, educated here, or are second or third generation. The other one, of course, was the Muslim ban, and it had a particularly nefarious effect on Iranian communities in the context of the US, in that people were separated, families were not able to visit, and essentially the flow of Iranian immigrants to the US was greatly slowed by the Trump administration's ban on Muslims from 7 countries, and including Iran. This is an article by a Southern-based attorney, Azadeh Shah Shahani, who wrote about the idea of Iranian-Americans being sort of villainized from inside the United States. This is a graphic. I've been sort of thinking a little bit about the confluence of how various experiences, both in representation, in self-identification, in how people contest some of the ways that they're represented, and then also mobilizing around politics and policies, creates the opportunity for something called a diaspora community, diaspora consciousness, and that would be all these, the sort of overlay of all these circles. It could also be, you could equally say that in some ways these are the moments where people identify themselves in sort of an intersectional context. They may be Iranian, but they might also be gay, they might also be Black, they might also be multiracial, and that the diaspora is not a static thing, but it's kind of continually influenced by these outside forces and the overlay of multiple experiences and events. I have been thinking a lot about, and in fact, in our initial conversation about me talking, Dr. Bakhtiari and Dr. Shannon and I were talking a lot about the role of social media. And I think it's really phenomenal how much social media has played a role in articulating, exploring, and conferring experiences and identifications of Iranianness, and I would argue Iran-clusiveness in the US context for sure, but also it's what connects people beyond the US to each other. So you see the proliferation of websites and Facebook sites and Instagram sites that are linking people from various national contexts through the lens of an Iranian diaspora experience. And I'll show you a few of those in a minute. I recently had the experience of working with or hosting somebody who was here in the Bay Area working on our PhD dissertation. Her name is Maral Shamshiri Fard. And she asked me a really interesting question. She said, I don't really know what the Iranian diaspora is. And what ensued was a conversation. And I think by the end of her 2-month stay here, she said something that really struck me. She said, I feel more connected to the diaspora than I do to Iran. And now I understand why, because I've met so many people like me who are born outside of Iran, but have a connection to Iran. And that kind of connection, I think, is one that is sometimes difficult to nail down and identify in a singular way. But I asked her recently, what to put it in her own words. And she says, I find myself thinking things like Nowruz, Charshamba Suri, Sizdabadar are ways that we are connected in the Iranian community. and I see it explicitly being shared online. And this outward expression perhaps makes us feel Iranian. I wonder if it's something that we feel, that makes us feel more Iranian and closer to Iran. I wonder if it's the same in Iran, or if it is, sorry, I have to move this, or if it's taken as seriously as it is here. Maybe there's something about these traditions that counters the narratives that are so negative in the media. And in the same breath, she mentioned the release of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe from jail, and how an event like that suddenly put Iran back on the consciousness of Britons. Then she followed by saying, I always thought of the diaspora as static, simply as Iranians living outside of Iran, but it is much more expansive. It's something so global. You can find all those cultural markers of food, traditions, sure, but it's also a feeling. And this really interested me, this idea that she said it's a feeling being part of the diaspora. I don't think of it anymore as negative being outside of Iran. I don't think of it as us being inauthentic or not original. It's something else. We are making the diaspora. And I love this idea of making the diaspora, meaning it's evolving and contingent. Oops, sorry. I wanted to show you a little bit about some of the Instagram sites that I have both seen, watched, and also which we participate in some ways at the center. This is Dr. Claudia Yacobi's Nowruz Hafsin, and we did a kind of campaign on the center's Instagram recently about share with us your Hafsin, and it was amazing just how many Hafsins you could see over the course of, the 2 weeks before and after the actual solstice. And then also the one on the right is a Bay Area friend who's celebrating Yalda in this photo and sharing her Yalda spread. There's sort of two things that I think are going on that are a little different than Iranian.com, and that is that it's both to share and celebrate our Iranianness, our Iranian diasporic experience, but it also is something that's being projected outwardly. So now I think people, to a great extent, know a little bit about Iranian rituals and holidays. And it functions, I think, somewhat to what Maral said in her, that it confers a kind of Iranianness, but also counters some of the negative experiences. I wanted to also point out the role of social media in other contexts in which the homogenizing, perhaps, tendency to think of Iranian in one singular way has been challenged, and that's the Collective for Black Iranians, who emerged, I think in 2019. We did an event with them very early, and they grew out of, I think, conversations about the Black Lives Matter protests. Not that they were singularly identifying with that experience, but I think Iranians in the diaspora were rushing to figure out how to respond to some of the events of 2019, for example, when George Floyd was murdered. And then there was a whole conversation about Iranians for Black Lives, and the Collective for Black Iranians identified that Iranians do have Black lives. There are Black Iranians. And this has shaped a whole very interesting conversation by the Collective for Black Iranians about understanding both that people are Iranian and Black, both in Iran and outside of Iran as well. So it's also introducing another way in which the omissions and erasures of Blackness in the Iranian communities outside of Iran and also inside of Iran are being challenged and also amplifying that experience. So I really recommend their social media platform is very interesting, and their interest in is trying to create a greater consciousness about how Black Iranians are indeed part of the diaspora. We did a podcast with them, so I'm just showing you the podcast we did, and a very strong argument is being made for that it's time to talk about race in the context of Iran and Iranians, as opposed to just talking about it, say, in the US context. Another social media site and phenomenon that I've been watching is Facebook groups that are dedicated to all assortment of Iranian connections, both in their identities and in their experiences. And this is one that I have been watching for a while. It's called Half Persian / Iranian. It's for people like me who are a child of one Iranian parent. And you can see their about page is identifying that, there's challenges in being half Iranian. So this is a posting by somebody who said, "My mom linked me to this group, interested to learn more about your respective experiences. My mom is white, my dad is Persian, born in Tehran, immigrated to America in the late 70s. I look white, Irish even. Nobody would even know I'm Iranian were it not for my last name. Guess I've internalized being more Caucasian as a result. Proud to be half Iranian and wish I knew Farsi and felt in touch with my roots, but my dad's family is very cold and borderline cruel. They've always made me feel like an outsider." So I think also the display of painful experiences, not just about Iran or leaving Iran, but also of trying to fit in within the Iranian community or an Iranian family. One of the campaigns that we've done on the center's social media site that I think is really interesting is to be very inclusive and to identify LGBTQ plus folks and make a space for them. And I'm not aware that many other academic institutions are doing that, but I think it's very important because in some ways, this is part of the intersectional identities that I see emerging in, at least in the US context, and I would imagine elsewhere, that people are proud of being Iranian, but they also don't want to feel ashamed of being queer or trans. And there are ways in which our ability to identify and include them, I think, is important work. So this is a campaign that we started 2 years ago, and people love it. And they love it because I think what it does is really a diverse representation of Iranians from across the US and also across the spectrum of how people identify themselves, either in their gender or sexuality. So this is Persis Karim on the left, my left, and she has been, out for a long time, talking a lot about it and talking about how important it is to make space for younger queer Iranians. The one in the middle is also somebody that I thought was very interesting, very public and I would argue some vulnerability in the way people publicly share these stories about trying to feel some acceptance and also rejecting some of the shame that has been associated with being queer and Iranian. And then the last one is a trans person who participated in our Proud of the Diaspora. I'm sort of shifting a little bit to some of the work that the center has been involved with, because one of the things that I recognize is that our presence on social media is really important to people feeling like, even though we're an academic center, there's some opportunity for them to connect with the ideas and the emerging ideas of what it is to be in the Iranian diaspora. So this was a recent post for this Monday campaign called This Iranian-American Life. And this is a young woman who's talking about growing up post 9/11 and struggling with the experience of being called a terrorist, but also finding more positive identifications with her current context. And then the last one is another Iranian-American life posting by somebody who's half Iranian, who grew up with a white father and an Iranian mother and struggled with that feeling of acceptance and belonging. Another thing that I'm really intrigued by is how social media is affecting conversations in one place and instigating some of the same kinds of conversations elsewhere. And this posting was, we did a call for in the global diaspora because we wanted to make sure that we weren't so localized to the United States. So this is a series that we do on the social media site. And this young woman is Swedish Iranian, grew up in Sweden, and she talks a little bit about, you know, how she's kind of come to some diaspora consciousness in more recent years. She went to graduate school. And interestingly, she took the same idea that we have of this Iranian-American life. So the last image is her her new site called Min svenske iranske erfarenhet, which means my Swedish Iranian experience. So of course, I think it's great that people borrow those kinds of ideas, and she's now documenting Swedish Iranians using social media, and I think it functions on two levels. One is it's of course trying to find ways to identify positively with these experiences, but also I think as a result of the pandemic, it is the way in which many people felt some sense of community over the last 2 years. And I would argue it's probably going to continue beyond the sort of waning experience of the pandemic. And then I'm just going to conclude with a few projects that we're working on in the center that involve digital media. So we're working on a documentary film called The Dawn is Too Far, Stories of Iranian-American Life, which is really about Iranians in the Bay Area. A digital archive project, which I hope to expand, and also I hope to encourage others who are interested in bridging the history of Iran with the history of immigration to build digital archives that can be useful to future generations. And then we're, just for people's information, we're sponsoring a conference with UCLA Near Eastern Studies on global perspectives on the Iranian diaspora, and trying to encourage young scholars to take up this field, because I think there's so much important work to be done. And then I just want to conclude by thanking everybody who's here, but also encouraging you to follow our work. It's a small but mighty force, and I think also we're helping to sort of create a vocabulary for new scholarship, both in the US and globally. And I've been fortunate in recent months to be introduced to people who are doing this kind of work in Australia, in New Zealand, in Hungary, of course, in France and England and Sweden as well. But I think there's a lot of people around the globe who now recognize that it's important to find ways to study not just Iranian immigration and migration, but also to understand the impact of what has happened to those individuals and communities in these various host countries. So I'm mostly kind of giving you my observations and insights, but also I'm eager to hear any questions or comments.
Thank you very much for that informative lecture. Before I pass it to Matt, I want to thank you for all the good work you're doing at the center and how important that work is to the Iranians abroad and kind of finding a connection, which you so aptly put in together, that it is so important to build that connection. So one question I got in the chat is that if you review the literature and the work published by Iranian-Americans in the US and others, do you see in the conclusion of their work an attempt to turn the page, to kind of call on Iranian diaspora to kind of make it, as you said? How do you see the conclusion of some of those work, the literature by Iranians outside of Iran, and how does that kind of differ from other Iranian scholars inside Iran when they want to talk about Iranians abroad? So have you noticed kind of a bridge between the two emerging?
Yeah, well, I don't know if turning the page is the metaphor I would use, because I do think as long as we're in the kind of political deadlock that we have with Iran, I think it's both what fuels some of these conversations and some of the anxieties and unsettledness of both these communities and also the discourse. But I also think that it's impossible for us not to evolve beyond, you know, the sort of, I mean, most everybody will use 1979 as the sort of emanating historical event for talking about large-scale migration, which is natural and important. But I also think diaspora is not about a singular event. It's also about sort of looking at the ways we interact with and participate in either Iranian culture or in evolving Iranian culture or experience in a contemporary way. So my sense is, rather than turning the page, we perhaps are less focused on the past and more on the future, you know, or less focused on the past and more focused on the present. And that people are responding to local concerns as much as they are to national or international concerns. But I think one thing is true is that in some families, whole families have now left Iran. So their connection to Iran is a tenuous one. So it's perhaps more important to sort of see some of these rituals or traditions or holidays as the way it gets carried on in terms of a connection. But I think it's also because of the situation, because of the political situation, and because of our lack of ease about it, at least I would say in the US, I'm again speaking as a North American, because of that situation, I think it's always kind of influenced by political and historical events that are taking place. Maybe that won't be the case in a country where there's a much smaller population, or where assimilation is sort of the rule, right? Whereas in the United States, we have a different ethos about how to be an immigrant and how to both kind of fit in, but also not lose everything. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Matt. Do you have any other questions?
Well, yeah, and we have some questions coming in from the group, so we have plenty to talk about. I just kind of have a comment and a quick question, and then we can start to field some that are coming in. I really was interested in the part of your talk about the internet and social media, and I know that in one of your essays you write about how an internet-mediated world constitutes another kind of home. This is a quote from one of your essays. And, I was going to ask about that, but I feel like I don't have anything left to ask because of, how well it was covered. I was especially interested to see that, kind of this predates even kind of the social media age. And you kind of took it back to Iranian.com and, kind of some of the earlier era of kind of the internet being used to constitute this other kind of home. So I think you just gave us so much to think about on that front. So just thank you for that. My question is actually kind of just about the evolution of the field of Iranian diaspora studies. And that's something I was taken by, again, kind of rereading some of your kind of work, just how central you've been over the years to the development of this field. And I'm assuming probably when you were beginning, there was an Iranian studies model and maybe some ways of studying other diasporas, the Jewish diaspora or whatever it may be. And I just wonder if you had anything you'd like to tell us about, kind of working through that kind of disciplinary context to create this new discipline, if there's something you were drawing on from scholars of other diasporas, or if there were any really important insights from Iranian studies that you kind of took with you or whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And absolutely, it's, I'm so pleased to see how the field has evolved. I think, we sort of teeter on the edge of many disciplines. And I think Iranian studies is, both a mother and a stepmother, I think, because there are ways in which, for example, American studies can be a more comfortable fit for some scholars who are doing this kind of work, thinking about people who came here before 79 and who are looking at those early immigrants in the 50s and 60s and 70s and the ways in which they were changed by the experience of getting an education here. So I do think that it's by necessity, it doesn't comfortably fit in one discipline. And I don't think it completely fits comfortably in the Iranian studies model, because to some degree it's, historically, I would say Iranian studies had more of a past looking model. I think it's changed a great deal too. And I think they both have sort of evolved in tandem with the ways in which Iranian studies has both faced a lot of limitations because of the regime in Iran, how difficult it is to go do field work or get funding. So I think there's a way in which Iranian diaspora studies is the outgrowth of some of those challenges. But I think there's more conversation about how there should be more interaction between the Iranian studies model and this emerging Iranian diaspora studies model. I think, just to sort of suggest something about my own evolution is that there wasn't very much, and I'm grateful to the people like Hamid Nafisi who really sort of articulated this first idea of sort of exilic or outside the nation, or the unhomeliness of diaspora, because I think it gave people a lot of pause for thought that it's not exclusively a national context anymore that we're talking about. And I think it would be, I don't like to use the word post-nation, but I think there's some way in which post-nationalist is a useful term to be thinking about, because it embodies this idea that, or transnational is actually, to me, a better term. And I think that now we're seeing the kind of really important field work and re-articulating aspects of the assumptions that have sometimes been made about Iran and Iranian nationality that were kind of wrapped up in the period of the Shah and then in the post-revolution period. And in some ways, the diaspora context gives us the opportunity to wrestle with some of those things that haven't been wrestled with, like Baha'is or, even queer Iranians and the challenges they face. So I think it's an exciting and certainly attenuated by some of the things that have also happened in Iranian studies. I hope that I answered that. It was very long-winded.
Oh yeah, certainly. Eric, I'll just ask a few kind of questions that are in the Q&A, and I don't know if they will relate, but I'll ask 2 or 3 here to give us some more material to think about. One question relates to the question of Islamic and non-Islamic identities in the diaspora and kind of how that functions. One question relates to education in the United States for the Iranian-American community, and the question of kind of private schooling versus public schooling, or kind of the best scenarios for kind of young Iranian Americans in the education system. And then the third question relates to the possibility of reverse migration, the idea that if somehow the relationship between the US and Iran changed and the countries became friends, if there would be any kind of reverse migration of Iranians moving from the United States back to Iran. So I don't know if you'd like to take any of those 3 questions or all of them, or whichever is most interesting.
I'll try my best to answer. I can see them in the chat. So do I see any distinctions between Islamic and non-Islamic? Yeah, I actually think there's a lot more pride that I see on, say, social media platforms where people are Iranian and Muslim and not afraid to articulate it. Do I consider an important issue? Yes, I do. It's not one that I think anybody has yet tackled in great depth, but I think it's really important to think about religious identity as one facet of Iranian identity. And I think, again, if you're outside of Iran, in a place like the United States, it might be easier to get people to talk about that question. Certainly there are, of course, I noticed you have a speaker who's talking about Assyrians, and I know several Iranian Assyrians in the Bay Area who feel like that story hasn't been very well developed at all. So I do think it's an important religious and ethnic identities within the Iranian context that in some ways people feel safer to identify them outside of Iran. and feel like it's a source of pride and distinction. The question about public versus private schools, I don't know of very much research, but I think one example that I can give is that there's a immersion school in the Bay Area called Golistan, which initially was only Persian, and now it's Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian. And I think it would be interesting to sort of study how, for example, children who have the experience of growing up in either an immersion school like that, or have, taken Farsi school from the age of 6, identify differently than those who have not. And Neda Makbule's book, in some senses, deals a little bit with that through the experience of Camp Ayande, but I don't think anyone's done any work on that specifically. And I think it would be very interesting. Charles Kaminsky's question about reverse diasporas. There was a period in Iran when quite a few young people were going back to Iran. This was in the, his name is escaping me, the president who called for sort of reforms before Ahmadinejad. Do you remember? I'm blanking on
Khatami.
Khatami. In the period of Khatami's presidency, quite a few Iranians were going and doing either field work in Iran. In this one issue of Iranian Studies, I worked with a young woman who was a PhD candidate who was actually studying Iranian-Americans and Iranian Brits who had gone back to Iran. It's not very easy to do that right now because the climate is so unfriendly to scholars, never mind to people who are dual nationals. But I think there's a lot of interest in going to Iran. I think there's a lot of connections between people in Iran and people here, and young people in particular, I think would be hungry to do that. And I just think that the climate is quite unpredictable. And I think we're sort of paying the price for some policies and events that have happened in the last 4 years that have made it even more concerning for people to go. My prediction is yes. If things were different, a lot of people would go there. A lot of people would take advantage of it, both in terms of business, but also scholarship. And I think there's a lot of interest. I mean, I certainly get inquiries from people who are interested in learning more about Iranians who live outside of Iran. And, there's a kind of lack of opportunity for exchange, but I think it would absolutely be there. Then there's a question about the Iranian diaspora community in Israel, of which I don't know very much, so I confess to my ignorance on this subject, so I can't speak to that film. I think one of the things that I probably need to say is that class is a very important marker for how people identify themselves, both in positive and less obvious ways. And I think if you think about migration out of Iran, if you think about migration out of Iran more recently, you have to have a certain ability to garner the resources to get out of Iran, to get an education, and the sanctions have made that much more difficult. So you see a clear class distinction between people who are able to leave Iran and go get an education versus people who are, basically fed up and are suffering so much that they have no alternative but to migrate. I've been in contact with a young graduate student in Hungary, and he's told me that he's working on his master's in anthropology, and he said there's kind of two groups of Iranians in Hungary: the people who came, 30 or 40 years ago, and then more recent people who are, their parents are basically banking everything on their kid being able to migrate to a Western country because the sanctions have made it so difficult for families to, support, their children, and for the young people to have opportunities to get a job. So I think those differences in migration patterns are also class distinctions as well. And I think it's important to note those.
Well, thank you
I'm
very
Neda
much.
Chair.
One of my good friends and colleague, Manager Dorad.
I haven't seen you in years.
Wonderful to see you both. Persis, the last time I saw you, you were a PhD candidate at UT Austin. And that's when Mo Ghanum Parvar was in charge and all that. So it's so wonderful to see you.
Wonderful.
I so admired everything you had to say. And Bahman, it's so wonderful to see you, my friend. It's been a while.
Yes,
Been a while.
yes.
It's, one of the great things about these webinars, or plus of the COVID, is that you get to see a lot of your old friends that otherwise you may not get to see them. So it's wonderful to see both of you. And this was truly very thought-provoking, and I want to congratulate you. I was following you when you were putting a book of poetry by Iranian exiles together, Persis, and then we lost touch. So it's so wonderful to see that you're doing this work on diaspora. It's so needed and so tangible and relevant. I have 3 questions for you. And first is the distinction that you made between first and second generation Iranians was particularly fascinating for me. I can think of some of the issues, you briefly talked about the second generation is more in tune with literature of decolonialism, and having been brought here, seeing the racial relation and how other minorities, people go out of their way to be politically correct about them, so to speak. And with Iranians, as if they're in a category of permissible prejudice, the citation that you had from Graham, Senator Graham, that, I will be devastated if I find certain part of me is Iranian. You don't say that in regard to any other minority. And this goes back to my second part question, which is what I think is happening is that because of the political conflict in the last 43 years, there's a culture industry that is galvanizing this anti-Iranian sentiment. So by definition, if you're an Iranian American, you're in the category of permissible prejudice, that you can afford to do and say all sorts of things, that you simply will be aware of all sorts of lawsuits, that you may lose your job, you'll be fired. That is not applicable to Iranian American category. So we face a certain set of attitudes and behavior that is very unique to us because of that. The third, Majid Tehranian has a wonderful book titled Whitewashed. I had the privilege of reviewing it more than a decade ago. Not Majid, I'm sorry, John Tehranian.
Yeah.
Also in California. And his basic thesis is this, that Middle Eastern Americans don't have the white privilege. At the same time, they're not categorized in any protected minority, that they have certain rights, African Americans, Hispanics, even Asians. And by definition, most of the people in West Asia, that British called it Middle East, are Asian. They live in the Asian continent, but it's whitewashed that they're Asian. So they get none of that protected minority categorization, if you will. It's not a privilege categorization that may protect them against some of the prejudices that otherwise they may be targeted to. So they're again in the category of permissible prejudice. I recommend that book. It's excellent. It goes into experience of Arab Americans, but that so much also applies to Iranian Americans with a plus, and that has to do, we're not Saudi Arabia and UAE, and our governments do not have very good relation with US or have massive lobbies in the US as they do. So these are really some of the things that are political in nature, I'm aware, but they loom large for a study of what is peculiar or particular about Iranian diaspora and Iranian community that needs to be addressed, in addition all to those larger issues that you raised.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on any of what you said. I think one of the things that you know, makes your comments relevant to this question about what somebody asked earlier about, are we turning the page? It's difficult to turn the page, because as long as the discourse is so skewed against Iranians, I mean, we're sort of the whipping, Iranians are the whipping boy of the United States. That could change, right? With, you know, when you see what's happening with Russia and China, but I think to some degree, it's an expendable and often drawn on set of tropes that have been there for a long time. So I think when the Muslim ban took place, it was like many racialized laws that have been passed in this country. It's something that existed long before, and it gets recycled and redeployed in new ways and new times. And you know, the other thing that I think is so important is that the Iran nuclear deal was our one little bit of hope, and it doesn't appear to be possible that that's going to be resurrected anytime soon. I know they're working on it, but there are many people who are against it for all kinds of reasons. And as long as there's no rapprochement, formal policy rapprochement, I think some of those tensions and, again, the tropes that you identified will kind of continuously be there. And John Tiranian's book, I think, is an important book to read, as is Neda Nobari's, because they both discuss the sort of legality, the limits of legality that are available. It's also why people thought the census, being able to identify yourself on the census, was such an important tool to sort of counteract that. And that also doesn't appear to be possible anytime soon, and we have to wait for the next 10-year census to happen before. But I think the climate in the U.S. is unique for all the reasons that you identified. I don't know if I answered, but I think your points are well taken, Madam Chair John. Thank you, and it's great to see you.
Wonderful to see you. And to see you, Bahman, too.
Yes.
I tune in as much as I can.
Thank you so much, Manager.
Yes, keep up the good work, you all.
So let's go to another live question we had from Dr. Shireen Mahdavi. Was it? Raise the hand.
Let's see.
Oh.
No, the hand's no longer raised.
Oh, no hand raised. Okay. So go ahead, Matt. You can take the next questions.
We're sure we don't have any more hands.
There's a question here about Syrian Orthodox Christians in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. James Good is talking a little bit about how ethnic and religious subgroups in the diaspora become their own unique, they experience and develop their own unique subculture of either being Assyrian or Syrian, in this case, Syrian Christians. I think that this is true for many Middle Eastern groups in, say, in the United States, is that if you're Iranian Jewish, you have an experience of being a Jew in an Iranian context in Iran, and you also cultivate an Iranian Jewish experience in a place like California that makes you part of that subgroup that is probably more important than being Iranian per se. I would say that's true of many young people who feel that sense of what we now call intersectional identity, that they don't see it as exclusively being Iranian, but they see it as an inflection of Iranian with something else, queer, trans, biracial, Black. In the case of the Collective for Black Iranians, I think they're interested in that idea that they have more connection to their Blackness, or their Blackness as a historical experience connects them to Black Iranians in the south of Iran, or people who are products of mixed marriage in places like Africa. So I think that's why I find it a fascinating and still evolving field, is that there are many ways in which the diaspora is not, it's difficult to define it in a singular way. It relies on the confluence of multiple experiences and identities. And I think that sort of circle that I was pointing to in the middle, between mobilization, identification, contestation, is in some ways where the heart of diaspora experience lies.
Yeah, just to pick up on that question, we have one about kind of thinking about the pre-1979 years, and the comment is made that in the 50s and 60s there was a very large Iranian student community in the United States, and it would seem that many of them would consider themselves part of the diaspora too. So I guess I'm just wondering if you would like to speak to the question of kind of pre and post 1979 Iranian community in the United States.
Yeah, I think it's a really fertile conversation to have, because I do think if you think of the ways in which I'll just use myself as an example. My father came in 1946 after the end of the Second World War. He wasn't really he wasn't an intentional immigrant. He came here. He had been working on the railroads, and he was sent here to study the US railroad system because he was supposed to go back and work on a sort of post-war conversion. And he himself was rather cynical about Iran's prospects for the future as a result of, the Cold War. I mean, he was an individual who I think didn't have that context of younger people who were studying. But I would say the people who came after him in the post-Mossadegh period in the 60s and 70s, I most definitely would want to include them in the diaspora, because I think to some degree they laid the foundations for later groups of people to come here. And they also changed the consciousness of Iran when they went back to Iran. So it's not a definitive by time thing to me. It's also this idea that we can begin to understand the experience of those early immigrants and how they shaped how later immigrants were able to do things that were not there for them. And I see it, for example, in some of the people who've come in the last 10 years, absolutely benefited from those earlier migrations to the US, whether they stayed here or went back to Iran. There's a new book about Zoroastrians who left Iran and went to India. That's another diaspora that I think is important to consider. We didn't historically call it that, but I think that's what it is. And it's this idea of also shaping historical events, but also shaping national consciousness, or consciousness in a diaspora context that makes you somewhat different from even your compatriots where you are. So I think it's absolutely important to expand our notion beyond a 79 timeline.
It's interesting to think the film that you were discussing with us recently about Nowruz in Northern California, if I have that right. I mean, it's from a time period that is kind of from the Cold War, kind of a period that's associated with, kind of Iranian students and the anti-Shah movement. But what that kind of film shows is that kind of the student community in the early 60s is doing a lot of the same things that folks are doing in person, on social media and elsewhere today, which is, kind of engaging with cultural dynamics and Nowruz celebrations and things. And that's just a fascinating parallel.
Yeah, that's a good example, I think, of that. And I think also that, we don't know what the net results of, people's presence is sometimes until after you examine it and talk to people. And I think there's a lot of examination now going on of the Confederation of Iranian Students, and the ways in which people were interacting with social movements in this context, and then either bringing it back to Iran or deciding that this was where they felt they could make the most impact. So I think that examination of the 60s and 70s is something we're seeing a lot. Manijeh Moradian's book is coming out in December, I believe. And then a new memoir by Neda Samnani Tolui deals with her parents, who were students in California in the 60s and ended up going back to Iran. And then her father was executed and her mother ended up coming back here. So I think, there's a way in which we do indeed need to look at the sort of circularity of it.
So let me give a break to Matt. And I wanted to ask, another question has come in about the tendency of the diaspora community to become anti-regime today, and also pre-1979 when the student movement was kind of anti-Shah. Do you see this tendency of the diaspora community to kind of become politicized, and to a certain extent there's a continuity to this, right? Before the revolution, they were anti-Shah, today it's anti-regime.
Yeah, I think it's less hard and fast maybe than it was, because I do think that people are, they're romantic about the Shah, and there are people who kind of traffic in that kind of nostalgia about it was so much better. But I think for people who are second or third generation, they don't see a time period in Iran that is particularly theirs. I think it's more a longing to be connected to Iran, as opposed to a longing to have Iran return to a particular, ruler or regime. I do think that, there has been an anti-imperial discourse that has run through, from the 1960s on, which would identify, the Shah, as the sort of culprit for the policies. But now there's also, there's also people who are examining, say, the 1953 coup of Mossadegh as an even earlier moment of historical turmoil that we have to account for in terms of understanding. So I don't know if I would, I'm not comfortable, to be honest with you, saying that there's a trend, because I would say that among younger people, there's less interested in politics altogether. You know, the sort of less interested in identifying one regime, you know, the Shah's regime versus the Islamic Republic. And I would say there's more desire for an opportunity to connect outside political discourse. And I think, you know, it was the oxygen of many young people in the 60s and 70s. And I don't really see it that way as much anymore among second or third generations of people living outside of Iran. And I think you even see that with people who have left Iran recently. They're like fed up with politics. They don't really want to talk about it, right? They're not happy with what's happening in Iran, and they certainly, I think, don't have the memory of a time beyond the one that they've lived through. So I would say that it's again might be more class-based than anything else to have those notions of you know, either looking back, and I mean, you see it on, like, for example, you see Manoto, the social platform Manoto has some nostalgia about the past, but I also think there's been so much critical work done on the period of the Shah and the kind of unholy alliances between the US and Iran that I don't see it as something that's sort of filtered in an immediate way into the consciousness of people. I would say there's more people who see themselves as part of the Iranian diaspora in a positive way outside the political realm.
Very good. I totally agree with you. And Matt, you want to address a couple of more questions to Persis before our session ends? Thank you.
Yes. Unless Persis, maybe you see one you'd like to respond to.
Well, there's a question here that says, are diaspora studies an attempt to try to maintain an Iranian exile community that might otherwise dissipate? No, I don't think so. I think diaspora studies are efforts to understand the shifting cultural and consciousness, and again, pointing to the US context, I think it's difficult to call it exile. It's not an exile community. It's no longer people who see themselves as being forced out of Iran. It's people who identify with aspects of Iran, but don't wholly identify either with aspects of US, say US or whatever host country they're in. And Manu Chair's comment about permissible prejudice is one way that diaspora communities respond to both the events of the past, but also what's taking place in the now. Hopefully I answered that.
I would just be curious to ask maybe one more question of my own, and feel free to respond to any other questions that are out there that, you know, or haven't been responded to. But so much of the work that you seem to do at the center focuses on kind of place, the particular kind of place of Northern California, and kind of how that intersects with, you know, kind of Iran. Are there, you know, particularly unique or you know, kind of locally kind of specific features of the Iranian-American community in Northern California that one might not find, say, in Texas or Northern Virginia or even Southern California?
Yeah, I think that's a really important concept that I often feel like it both limits me and excites me, which is, that's why I sort of started the presentation saying, I reside here. My observations are in some ways largely informed by the experience of being in North America, in Northern California, in a state where lots of Iranians live. One of the things that I think is unique to the Bay Area and probably distinguishes it from Los Angeles, which has the largest number of Iranian immigrants and probably second and third generation Iranian-Americans. Here, what I see is the influence of large numbers of people who pass through public education at a particular moment in time. So we have a longer history of social engagement with US institutions, whereas the population in Southern California was concentrated around the events of '79. They were much more moneyed groups of people. And here there is, to some degree, a kind of institutional memory of both participating in, political activism, but also cultural activism. So one of the things that people say when they come to California is they're like, oh, I have Iranian diaspora envy about the Bay Area, because there's a lot of sort of ease with which people come here and find, groups of people who are doing similar things, whether they're artists or musicians. And I think because there were very early on people who ended up staying here and, built theater groups or went to art school, and so have introduced Iranian arts. I would say it's more ragtag than perhaps in Southern California, but I think there are elements of that earlier presence as a result of education. The numbers of students who went to San Jose State, who went to San Francisco State, who went to Berkeley were just phenomenally larger even than UCLA. And so therefore their influence is certainly felt. I'll just give you an example. A couple weeks ago, the grandson of Ahmad Shamloo contacted me, and he's writing a book about his grandfather, and he's from England. And he wanted to know, did I know anybody who knew Ahmad Shamloo when he stayed in Northern California in the 90s? And I was like, yes, I know exactly. And so I introduced him to my friend Persis, who's about 80, and Persis knew like 5 other people. And what sort of ensued was some really interesting stories about political tensions, people vying for, Ahmad Shamloo's attention when they were here, but also, it's this kind of longer institutional memory about people who participated both in Iranian culture and politics much earlier on, and therefore were positioned for receiving people in the 80s and 90s, and were having quite vigorous debates about, what was going to happen to Iran post '79. And I think that's something that I'm really interested in, is like that kind of subculture of Northern California is really different than Los Angeles. And then I think the other thing is like Silicon Valley is its own unique incubation for Iranian Americans in the tech sector. And somebody should be doing something about that as well, I do absolutely think every place has its own, unique experience. And I think it depends on a lot of things, how easy is it for people to to have established themselves. And, you know, places like maybe Australia are an interesting, I mean, that's why Amy Malek's work is important. She's doing comparative studies of different Iranian communities in places like Sweden, Canada, and Los Angeles. And I think the comparative piece is very important for us to understand something about the distinctions about these communities across the globe. And I think people are starting to do it in Australia as well, and Malaysia, and in the Gulf states, there's large populations of Iranians there as well. So I think that those comparative understandings are really key to kind of enriching the, you know, so it's not US centric.
Well, maybe we could have time for one more question. We've kept Persis for long enough. So Matt, why don't you address the last question for Persis?
Well, I'm sorry for any questions that were left out, but there's a question here about growing up. Well, you might be able to read it, Persis. It's fairly long, but growing up in the 90s.
Kids in the 90s who grew up in Iran and then became immigrants in the past decade. We maybe didn't feel so Iranian when we were living there. We were mostly outsiders, constantly fighting with the police in the streets and getting in trouble in school and university. But since our immigration, we became Iranian in a sense. And I see that as a confrontation with whiteness. I wish to write about this for my studies here in Europe, but mostly as a critique of whiteness. Could you recommend some resources to me? Super interesting. I think that's a, whoever the person is, I will happily, if you email me, I can probably direct you to some articles and perhaps some individuals that you might talk to. But I think the point that's really interesting is to have grown up in Iran feeling outside. I've heard people say this, they feel like they're in exile in their own country. And young people, perhaps, who grew up in the era of social media and the internet and, you know, cell phones, feel some alienation from the regime in Iran. And then when they come to the United States, they're looking for people who are more like them, who have this shared experience of an Iranianness that they perhaps took it for granted in Iran, but they become Iranian, or, you know, they sort of coalesce. And I definitely see that among newer Iranian arrivals, both students and non-students. I see them sort of gravitating towards a concept of like, we're Iranian, but we didn't fit in Iran, and we don't quite fit in here. And I think also experience some of that vilification, right? I recently helped a student last year who got accepted to our university, and because of the pandemic, they told her at the last minute, you shouldn't come because we don't have any classes in person for you. And she had actually won a fellowship, and I like told the university, you can't do this. This is so important to this person because they have likely spent the last 3 years preparing to come here, saved up all their money, went and got a visa. And when she got here, it was still in the Trump thing. And she started to ask the question like, wow, you know, what did I come to, right? And of course, the pandemic was its own unique experience for her. But I think in some ways it brought attention to this idea of both how alienated she felt from being able to do some of the work she wanted to do in Iran, but how she had to surmount a certain set of problems once she got here and realized, oh, I'm part of that group of people that's often viewed with scrutiny around the world, you know, the Iranians who So I do think it's a really important thing. And I think whiteness as a concept, just to speak to the person's question, I think we have to be careful what we mean by whiteness, because I think in the US, it has a particular meaning that might not be the case in Europe. You know, here we have the historical experience of slavery and enslaving people and Blackness. But I think racialized identities in Europe are indeed conflated with Islamic identities. And I think that's an area that needs to be explored in other contexts as well as in the United States.
Well, thank you so much, Persis. I mean, I think the questions will keep coming, and we definitely have to bring you back again. Such a fascinating topic, and so many different narratives and issues that we need to talk about. And it's been such a helpful presentation for us, for our audience, for people who are really listening to you. I want to thank you on behalf of the Institute for making time, preparing the presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again. We hope we can live stream your conference coming up.
Yeah, well, I will talk to my colleagues. I think it's something that they are really interested in, making access available to people around the world.
We'd be more than happy to live stream it to our audience, and we appreciate everything you're doing for the Iranian Diaspora Studies and all the good work that you've done at San Francisco State. So thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah. We will provide a recording of this event on our website, and we'll send it to everyone. And thank you, Matt, for participating today and asking all the good questions.
Thank you, Persis. It was a great talk.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Bahman and Dilara, and I look forward to being in conversation again.
Yes, thank you so much, Persis.